welcome to Knit Pickers PEI in Mayfield, which is a small community about 5 kilometers south of Cavendish Beach on beautiful Prince Edward Island. Today's video tutorial is going to be how to do an I-cord cast on. Now a few weeks back I did do a tutorial on how to do an I-cord edging, a knit as you go I-cord edge. But today we're going to work on a cast on. So shall we get started? Now in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you two different ways of doing the I-cord cast on. In both cases, you start out with the same technique. You start out by casting on 3 stitches, and I use the long tail cast on method. What some folks do when they're doing a long tail cast on is they make a slip knot, slide that onto their needle, and then carry on from there, casting on their stitches. And that works just fine, but my preference is to do a slightly different way. When you do the long tail cast on with a slip knot, it creates a little bump, a little lump on that first stitch, which I'm not a fan of, and sometimes it can create a little gap right there. So what I do is I make a triangle with my wool, press down in the center, under the loop on the thumb, over the loop on the forefinger, through the loop, and you've created your first 2 stitches. Let's try that one more time. Form your triangle, press down in the center, under the thumb, over the forefinger, through the loop, and there are your first 2 stitches. No gap, no lump. And then you just carry on with your long tail cast on as you normally would. If you are unfamiliar with how to do the long tail cast on, I do have a video tutorial on that, and I'll put a link to it in the notes below. So now I've cast on my 3 stitches for my I-cord cast on. What you want to have happen is you want your working yarn to be coming from the left hand stitch. So if I was working with regular straight needles, I would take this and I would transfer purlwise these 3 stitches over to my left hand needle so that my working yarn is coming from my left hand stitch. But if you are working with double pointed needles, or you're working with circular needles as I am right here, I'm using the Kollage square circular needles, you can just simply slide your stitches on down to the other end of the needle, which results in the same thing. I have my working yarn coming from the left hand stitch on my needle. So in both cases, in both techniques that I'm going to show you how to do the I-cord cast on, you start out exactly the same way. You start out by knitting front and back in that first stitch. So to knit front and back, you go into the stitch as you normally would to knit. Knit that stitch, but don't take it off your needle. Instead, you take your right hand needle, swing it around, and go into the back of the stitch and knit that as well. I've now got 2 stitches coming out of one original stitch, and I'm just going to snug that up a bit. So I've knit front and back to create 2 stitches, and then I knit the next 2 stitches. So there we go. So now I have 4 stitches on my needle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer purlwise these 3 stitches over to my left hand needle, leaving 1 stitch on my right hand needle. So once again into that first stitch, and I'm going to knit front and back. So through the front, knit through, but don't take it off my needle, through the back, Whoops, I've caught a little bit of this other stitch through the back. Up and over, I've now got 2 stitches, and knit these last 2 stitches. Snug everything up a little bit, and once again, transfer 1, 2, 3 stitches over. Now you can make your I-cord as thin or as fat as you want. I'm using a 3-stitch I-cord cast on. You could do 4 stitches, you could do 5 stitches if you wanted something really bulky. With this particular technique, the simplified technique that I'm showing right here, on the 3-stitch I-cord cast on, it's a little bit narrower than the second technique that I'm going to show you. But all you do over and over and over again until you've achieved all the stitches that you want on your needle is on the first stitch on your left hand needle, go in and knit front and back. And always, always, I should point out, always your yarn is coming from the far left stitch. So knit through the front, don't remove it from your needle, into the back, whoops, in through the back, slide that on through, and then knit the next 2 stitches, and then transfer 3 stitches again to your left hand needle. And you just keep repeating that process over and over again until you have the number of stitches that you want. And you can see here, we're starting to get a little bit of an I-cord right there. Now, as I mentioned, with the first technique, your I-cord is going to be a little bit slimmer than this next technique that I'm going to show you. So if you wanted a slightly chunkier I-cord using this first technique, what you could do is you could cast on 4 stitches instead of 3 stitches. Then on your first stitch, knit front and back as we did, knit the following 3 stitches and transfer 4 stitches back to your left hand needle. Then on that first stitch on your left hand needle, knit front and back, knit the following 3 stitches, and then transfer 4 stitches back to your left hand needle. It's as simple as that. You could have an I-cord that's 5 or 6 stitches, but if you're casting on 5, you're transferring 5. Now, for the second technique, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, it's called a reverse yarn over I-cord cast on. We start out exactly the same. We make our triangle with our wool, doing the long tail cast on method, press down in the center, under the thumb, over the forefinger, through the loop. First 2 stitches are cast on. And 1 last stitch. Here we go. And once again, after doing your cast on, if you're using straight needles, you can transfer your 3 stitches over to your left hand needle, always transferring purlwise. Or in this case, since I'm using circulars and the same thing would apply to double pointed, I just transfer the stitches over to my left hand needle, so that way my working yarn is coming off my left hand stitch. So for the first stitch, we do it exactly as we did with the other technique. We're going to come into that first stitch, we're going to knit through the front as you would do a normal stitch, but not taking it off the needle, and knit through the back to create 2 stitches out of that first stitch. Slide that off your needle and knit the next 2 stitches. So far so good, exactly as we did with the other technique. Same thing again, I'm transferring these 3 stitches over to my left hand needle, and I'm just going to give everything a little snug up. Now here's where things get a little bit different. Instead of knitting front and back into that first stitch, I'm going to do a reverse yarn over or a backwards yarn over. Normally, to do a yarn over, we would just take our working yarn and wrap it around the needle. But in this case, we want our right-hand needle to lie over top of your working yarn and come from the back to the front and wrap it fully around your needle like that. And then you knit these 3 stitches. 1, 2, and 3. So that reverse yarn over has given you your extra stitch. Now we just transfer these stitches back onto our right-hand needle. Once again, we take our yarn, we lay our right-hand needle on top of the working yarn, and you can see the working yarn is coming from our left-hand stitch. Lay the right-hand needle on top of the working yarn, up and around she goes, and knit your 3 stitches. And once again, transferring 3 stitches over to your left-hand needle, always transferring purlwise. Backwards yarn over, knit 3 stitches, and transfer 3. And this same technique, you could also do it if you wanted to have a really nice chunky I-cord cast on. You could do this with 4 stitches or 5 stitches. Once again, transferring 4 stitches. If you've cast on 4 stitches, you transfer 4 stitches. If you've cast on 5 stitches, you transfer 5 stitches. It's as simple as that. What you will notice, and it might make you a little bit concerned, is when you look at the back side, it appears like there's some really long, stretched out stitches there. You might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't look right. I don't like the look of that. But not to worry. What you'll find is as you knit along on this, I'm just going to finish up this section. So let's just say I only wanted to cast on this many stitches. And there you can see my I-cord starting to form right here. And you can see these long stitches. What you do is after you've knit your I-cord and you're starting with your regular knitting, let me get my little swatch here. Once you've knit a couple of rows in your regular pattern, you would just give that a little tug, a little stretch. Those long stitches completely disappear. And you ended up with a nice, chunky I-cord cast on. So the first technique might be a little simpler. You're always just knitting front and back in the first stitch and then knitting the subsequent stitches. In the second technique, for your very initial go round, you do knit that first stitch front and back and then knit the subsequent stitches and transfer them over. And then after that, you do the reverse yarn over. The first technique, your I-cord will be a little bit narrower. In the second technique, your I-cord will be a little bit chunkier. It's all a matter of personal preference. So I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial and you'll give it a try. I think that an I-cord cast on would make a really pretty edge, the hem of a sweater, or even the cuff of a sweater. Or say if you're knitting something top down, you could make it as your collar, or the cuff of a mitten. There's so many different ways you could use an I-cord cast on. Send me some pictures if you'd give it a try. And until next time, happy knitting.